The most powerful words ever spoken in Central Park came from a child who hadn't said anything for 3 years. When 8-year-old Lily Whitaker finally broke her silence that October afternoon, her first sentence would unravel a billion-dollar empire and expose secrets that Manhattan's elite had buried deep beneath their marble facades. In a city where silence meant weakness and words were currency, some people learned to disappear. Others learned to make themselves heard when it mattered most. Marcus Reed had perfected the art of invisibility. Every morning at 7:15, he pushed his book cart through the marble corridors of the Lenox Hill Public Library, wheels squeaking against polished floors that reflected the indifferent faces of early commuters. The smell of old paper and industrial disinfectant clung to his Navy volunteer vest, a uniform that made him background noise in a symphony of rushing suits and clicking heels. "Excuse me," came the familiar refrain as bodies moved around him like water around a stone. No eye contact. No acknowledgement that the man restocking children's books held 2 master's degrees and had once been the most sought-after speech therapist on the Upper East Side. That was before the clinic closed, before the divorce, before pride gave way to pragmatism, and he learned that helping kids find their voices could happen anywhere, even from behind a library cart that people pretended not to see. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look smaller than they were. Marcus arranged picture books by spine height, muscle memory guiding his hands while his mind wandered to the afternoon's reading group. Mrs. Chen's grandson still struggled with his R's. The Martinez girl had finally worked up courage to read aloud last week. Small victories in a world that measured success in stock options and square footage. "Hey, watch where you're going." The voice cut sharp and cold through the library's morning hush. Marcus looked up to see a woman in a tailored coat, charcoal gray, probably worth more than his monthly rent, glaring down at him with the particular disdain reserved for people who dared to exist in her peripheral vision. Charlotte Whitaker. Even if he hadn't recognized the face from Forbes covers, the way other patrons suddenly found urgent reasons to study distant bookshelves would have given her away. "Sorry, ma'am." Marcus moved his cart aside, noting how she didn't acknowledge the apology. Her gaze had already shifted to something more important, her phone screen, where numbers scrolled in endless green streams. Behind her, almost hidden in the shadow of her mother's presence, stood a girl with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. Lily Whitaker wore a navy coat that matched her mother's, but while Charlotte commanded attention, Lily seemed to fold in on herself, shoulders curved inward like parentheses around a secret. Marcus had seen that posture before. In his years working with children, he'd learned to read the body language of silence, the difference between won't speak and can't speak, between defiance and fear. This girl carried her quiet like armor, but underneath, he sensed something else, a pressure building like steam in a kettle with no outlet. "Come along, Lily." Charlotte's voice carried the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We have the park thing at 11. The girl followed without a word, but as they passed Marcus's cart, her eyes lingered on a picture book about a lost bird finding its song. For a moment, their gazes met. In that instant, Marcus saw recognition, not of him, but of something deeper, the understanding that passed between people who knew what it meant to be unheard. The library doors swung shut behind them, but the encounter stayed with Marcus, like a splinter under skin. Something about the girl's silence felt different from the selective mutism he'd treated before. This wasn't the stubborn quiet of a child refusing to engage. It was the careful silence of someone protecting something precious. An hour later, Marcus found himself walking through Central Park's northeastern corner, where October light filtered through yellowing leaves and the smell of fallen mulch mixed with expensive coffee from the vendors near the zoo. He'd told himself he was taking lunch early, but truthfully, curiosity had won out over common sense. The charity event was impossible to miss. White tents dotted the great lawn like expensive mushrooms, each one buzzing with the kind of conversation that happened when people discussed millions of dollars as casually as others talked about lunch plans. The banner stretched between 2 oak trees, speaking up for silent voices, a benefit for the Metropolitan Children's Foundation. Marcus lingered at the edge of the crowd, invisible again in his volunteer vest and discount khakis. Here, surrounded by Italian leather and Swiss timepieces, his invisibility felt less like a choice and more like a verdict. But Lily Whitaker was somewhere in that sea of privilege, and something about her silence called to the part of him that had never stopped being a therapist. He spotted them near a cluster of news cameras. Charlotte stood at a microphone, her voice carrying across the lawn with the practiced ease of someone used to commanding boardrooms. which is why I'm making this challenge. Find someone, anyone, who can get my daughter to speak today, and I'll donate $1 million to the library's children's literacy program." The crowd murmured appreciatively. Cameras swiveled toward Lily, who stood beside her mother like a small statue, hands clasped in front of her navy coat. Marcus felt his jaw clench. Making a spectacle of a child's trauma wasn't charity. It was exploitation with a tax write-off. Of course, we all know that's impossible. Charlotte's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. Lily hasn't spoken a word since the accident 3 years ago. The finest specialists in the city have tried everything. But hey, if someone wants to work a miracle today, I'm happy to pay for the privilege of watching them fail. Laughter rippled through the crowd, the kind of knowing chuckle that happened when rich people made jokes about problems money couldn't solve. Marcus watched Lily's shoulders curl even further inward, and something hot and protective flared in his chest. Before he could second-guess himself, he was walking toward the little stage. The crowd parted reluctantly, designer shoes stepping aside for his scuffed sneakers. Whispers followed in his wake. Who is that? Security should probably... Does he even belong here? Marcus ignored them all. His focus was on the girl who stood frozen in the spotlight, cornered by cameras and expectations. When he reached the edge of the small platform, he didn't climb up. Instead, he sat down in the grass, cross-legged, and pulled a worn paperback from his back pocket. "Mind if I read out here?" he asked Lily, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "It's awfully loud up there." Charlotte's microphone crackled. "Excuse me, sir, but this is a private event." "Mrs. Whitaker," came a voice from the crowd. Someone recognized him, though Marcus couldn't place the face. "That's Marcus Reed. He used to run the speech therapy clinic on Madison, before it closed." Interest flickered across Charlotte's features, like a shark sensing blood in the water. Here was a story angle, a human interest twist that might actually get her challenge some press coverage. "Well then, Mr. Reed, feel free to try your luck." Marcus opened his book, a battered copy of The Secret Garden that he'd read to hundreds of children over the years. The binding was soft from use, pages yellowed at the edges. He began to read, not projecting for the crowd, but speaking as if he and Lily were alone in the world. Mary Lennox was a contrary little girl who lived in India with her father and mother. The crowd grew restless. This wasn't the dramatic scene they'd expected. No coaxing, no therapeutic techniques, no breakthrough moments scored by swelling music. Just a man in a cheap vest reading a book to a silent girl while expensive people checked their phones and wondered when the real entertainment would start. But Marcus felt the shift, subtle as a change in barometric pressure, but unmistakable to someone who'd spent years listening to the spaces between words. Lily had taken a half-step closer. Her hands had unclenched. The rigid set of her shoulders had softened by degrees. He kept reading, letting the familiar rhythm of Frances Hodgson Burnett's prose fill the space between them. The story of a girl locked away from the world, who discovered that sometimes the most beautiful things grew in places no one thought to look. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Charlotte's smile had grown fixed, and Marcus could sense the crowd's attention beginning to fray at the edges. But Lily was listening, really listening, in a way that went deeper than hearing. Her storm cloud eyes were fixed on his face, and Marcus recognized the look. It was the expression of a child who'd found something they thought they'd lost forever. He turned a page and paused, looking up at Lily with the patient smile he'd perfected during his years in private practice. "Want to help me with this next part? There's a word here I'm not sure about." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the whisper of wind through dying leaves. The crowd held its collective breath. Cameras zoomed closer. Charlotte's knuckles went white where she gripped the microphone. Lily's lips parted. A breath escaped, barely audible, but Marcus caught it. The first sound she'd made in public in 3 years. "The house," she whispered, and her voice was rusty from disuse but clear as spring water. "The house isn't mine." The effect was electric. The crowd erupted in gasps and scattered applause. Charlotte's face went through a series of expressions: shock, confusion, and then something that looked almost like fear. But Marcus wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at Lily, who had just said the most important words of her young life, and he was beginning to understand that they meant far more than anyone realized. "The house isn't mine," she repeated, louder this time, and her eyes weren't on Marcus anymore. They were fixed on her mother, and in them was a kind of terrible knowing that made Marcus's blood run cold. Charlotte stumbled backward, one manicured hand pressed to her mouth. The microphone feedback screeched across the lawn, but nobody seemed to notice. They were all staring at the girl who had just spoken, and at the woman whose face had gone the color of ash. "Lily, sweetheart." Charlotte's voice cracked on the endearment. "What do you mean the house isn't yours?" But Lily had found her voice now, and 3 years of silence came pouring out in a rush of words that would change everything. "It's not our house. I heard you and Uncle Richard talking. You said the foundation owns it. You said we're just borrowing it until the investigation is over." The crowd's excited murmur died away to nothing. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear the sound of a woman's world collapsing. The sharp intake of breath, the rustle of expensive fabric, the distant wail of a siren that seemed to be growing closer. Charlotte's charity wasn't just about helping children find their voices. It was about making sure certain voices stayed quiet. And Lily Whitaker, the girl who hadn't spoken in 3 years, had just said the words that would bring it all crashing down. Marcus stood slowly, his book still clutched in one hand. Around him, the crowd was stirring like a disturbed anthill. Phones appeared, cameras swiveled. Someone was already making calls, to lawyers, to journalists, to federal investigators who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this kind of break. But Marcus only had eyes for Lily, who stood straighter now than she had all morning. The silence that had protected her was gone, but in its place was something stronger. She had found her voice, and she was going to use it. "Thank you," she said, looking directly at him. "Thank you for helping me remember that I don't have to be quiet anymore." The investigation that followed would uncover embezzlement on a scale that shocked even Manhattan's jaded financial district. The Whitaker Foundation had been funneling donations into a web of shell companies and offshore accounts, using sick children as cover for what amounted to the largest charity fraud in New York history. Charlotte Whitaker, the woman who had built an empire on the promise of helping vulnerable kids, had been stealing from them for years. But that would come later. In this moment, standing in the autumn sunlight with a girl who had just found her voice, Marcus felt something shift inside him. He thought of all the children he'd worked with over the years, all the voices he'd helped unlock, all the words that had been waiting for the right moment to be spoken. He looked around at the crowd, at the shocked faces, the hurried phone calls, the photographers capturing what would become front-page news by evening. Most of these people had walked past him that morning without a second glance. They had reduced him to his uniform, his skin color, his lack of obvious wealth. They had made him invisible. But Lily had seen him, not as a charity case or a diversity hire or a man pushing a cart through their marble halls. She had seen him as someone who understood the weight of unspoken words and the courage it took to finally say them out loud. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the newly renamed Marcus Reed Children's Reading Center at the Lenox Hill Public Library. His old therapy clinic had been rebuilt here, funded by the recovered Whitaker Foundation money and staffed by volunteers who understood that healing happened in quiet moments between strangers. Lily came to the reading group every Thursday. Her voice grew stronger each week, and she was learning to use words not as weapons or shields, but as tools for building the life she wanted. Her mother was awaiting trial in federal prison, but Lily had found a home with her grandmother, a woman who understood that some silences needed to be broken and others deserved to be honored. On this particular Thursday evening, as the last children filed out with their borrowed books, Marcus found himself alone in the reading room. Evening light slanted through tall windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. On his desk sat a small glass case containing his old volunteer badge, the one he'd worn the day he met Lily. It served as a reminder now for the visitors who came to hear his story and the children who needed to know that being overlooked didn't mean being worthless. He picked up his old copy of The Secret Garden, its pages even more worn now from constant use. Somewhere in the city, other children were waiting for someone to notice their silence, their struggles, their hidden gifts. Other voices were waiting to be heard. Marcus opened the book to the first page and began to read aloud to the empty room, his voice carrying the promise that every child who walked through those doors would be seen, heard, and valued for exactly who they were. When Mary Lennox was sent to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everybody said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. The words echoed off the walls of the reading center, mixing with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the city beyond. But here, in this quiet space built from the ruins of charity fraud and corporate greed, those words carried weight. They were a promise a prayer, and a reminder that sometimes the most important stories began with the people nobody thought to notice. Outside, the lights of Manhattan glittered like earthbound stars, and somewhere in those towers of glass and steel, other invisible people were waiting for their moment to be seen. Marcus closed the book and smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new voices, new stories, and new chances to prove that everyone, absolutely everyone, had something important to say. The most powerful words, after all, often came from the quietest voices. You just had to know how to listen. Talent knows no uniform, no accent, no zip code. Remember this story the next time you're tempted to look past someone whose voice you haven't learned to hear.